Hello and welcome to Restoration DIY. It's great to have you here and I hope you enjoy this video. In this episode I'll be making a bowl from random offcuts cast into red epoxy resin. So without further ado, let's get into it. After filling the casting mould with offcuts, I mixed the epoxy resin. It's my usual brand mixed at a 2:1 ratio as recommended by the manufacturer. For this project I wasn't sure if I would need 3 or 4 batches, so for a start I mixed 3. I could add more later if needed. The colour of choice was red mica powder. I wanted a solid colour, so I added a little bit extra colourant. With that done, I thoroughly mixed each batch. I'll just show one being done. With that done, I added them to the casting. It turned out that 3 batches was enough, so with a mould full, I added 2 kilograms of weight to stop the offcuts floating and placed it into the pressure pot. Okay, so I made a bit of an error in this next bit. This mould only just fits into the stainless liner, and it's more or less impossible to lower the full casting into it without spilling resin everywhere. I really should have put the mould in the stainless liner before doing the pour, so I had to do without the liner. So with the lid screwed down nice and tight, I added 50 to 55 psi and left it to cure in a warm room. It's 2 days later and the resin is cured with no visible cracks or voids. I broke off some of the easy to remove offcuts, then I marked the centre and drilled 2 holes, one for the woodworm screw and another for the tailstock centre. Holes drilled, I could fix it to the lathe using the woodworm screw and the tailstock for added support. That done, I turned the speed up to around 800 RPM and I could begin turning. I began with Easy Wood Tools full-size finisher. This blank was a bit unbalanced, so the first task was to get it to round, then I could turn the speed up. It soon became evident that this blank was not turning as well as the others had done. The cutter just wasn't peeling away material as easily. I thought I'd maybe mixed the resin a bit differently, and I'd also used a new brand of mica powder, but I was pretty sure that hadn't made it any harder, so I kept going, hoping it was just a tough outer layer. I soon got the blank to round and balanced, so I turned the speed up to around 1000 RPM and I began exposing the timber offcuts. The shape of the blank was very close to how I wanted the finished piece to look. It's why I used that particular mould, so there wasn't a lot of material to remove. I switched to the skew to remove the heavier tool marks, but this wasn't cutting very well either, so I stopped the lathe to take a look, and there was the reason: a nail in the casting. It had blunted the carbide, and it had also shredded the cutting edge on the skew. I needed a bit of time to think about what to do with the offending piece of metal, so I turned my attention to the base. First off, I cut a slightly raised foot about 5mm high. Then I levelled the base with a carbide cutter and the bowl gouge. Then I finished it off with a freshly sharpened skew. With the base levelled, I went back to finishing the side. I could either dig out the nail, which would then need repairing, or leave it in place. I decided on the latter. Sure enough, it would blunt the carbide and I would have to sacrifice a couple of cutting edges on the skew, but it seemed to be the lesser of two evils. Whilst finishing the side, I used a skew to better define the raised foot and create a curve to blend the base into the lower section. Next, I used the now totally blunted skew to mark the upper edge of the bowl, and then I used the 1/4 inch parting tool to cut into the blank about 1 inch deep to define the rim. Having finished the tool work on the outside, it just left the mortise to be cut. For this, I used the 1/4 inch parting tool to define the outer edge. Then I removed most of the inner material with a 3/8 bowl gouge before cutting the dovetail with a dovetail cutter. And finally, I removed the last little nubbins with a 1/4 inch bowl gouge. I'd hoped the woodworm screw would hold the blank well enough for sanding and finishing, but that wasn't to be the case. It was quite loose and barely gripping, so I had to use the tailstock, which meant I would have to sand and finish the recess later on. After sanding from 80 to 3000 grit, I cleaned down with denatured alcohol. Then I applied a liberal coating of a shellac-based sanding sealer, which I denibbed with a non-abrasive Scotch pad. Up next, Yorkshire Grit abrasive paste, just a single coat, cleaned away until no more residue is picking up on the paper towel. Next, the resin polishing, beginning with Merkur Polar Shine 10, a single application, thoroughly cleaned away, ready for the next stage. Polar Shine 5, another single coat, polished off to leave a deep shine. And to finish, Hampshire Sheen Gloss Finishing Wax. 2 coats, buffed with more paper towel to seal and protect the surface. Finishing done, I turned the bowl around so I could hollow out the inside. I used the 4-jaw chuck in the mortise and the tailstock for additional support until a lot of the weight had been removed. I used a 3/8 bowl gouge to remove the tops of the protruding offcuts, and once I was down into solid resin, I switched to the carbide cutter to level the top surface. I used the bowl gouge to start hollowing out. There were a few big chunks of oak in the casting, so working from the rim down into the centre, the gouge had no problem removing the waste material. Once I was down to a reasonable depth, I adjusted the tool post and switched to the carbide cutter. This was for 2 reasons. Firstly, the carbide cuts better in the lower part where there is more resin, and second, and more important reason, is that I didn't want to ruin my gouge on the other end of the nail. Using the carbide, I began thinning the bowl down. I was heading for a finished thickness on the thin side of 3/8 of an inch. It's also worth pointing out that the carbide was doing a great job of removing material. I hadn't changed or rotated the cutter to a fresh edge. It was just that at this angle, the blunted section wasn't contacting the bowl surface. With most of the weight gone, I could remove the centre support. After checking for any nails, I used a 3/8 bowl gouge to cut away the last piece in the base. The large negative rate scraper took care of the uneven surface. Then I used a skew chisel to clean up the rim and form a slight curve on the inner edge into the bowl. And to finish off the inside, I used the bowl gouge to remove the last few ridges. Then I blended and faired it all together with a scraper, and thankfully the nail hadn't shown itself. All done. Next, I sanded from 80 to 3000 grit. And after sanding, I applied the finish, the same as before. I cleaned down with denatured alcohol, then I applied sanding sealer, denibbed with a non-abrasive Scotch pad. Then Yorkshire grit, a single coat, which was thoroughly cleaned away before the resin polishing, using Polar Shine 10 followed by Polar Shine 5, and to finish, 2 coats of Hampshire Sheen gloss finishing wax. This is where the video normally ends, but there's just one thing to do, which I thought I'd show you. Tidying up the mortise. With the bowl refixed in the coal jaws, I used the mid-sized carbide to remove the bigger ridges, then the skew chisel to level it off, and using the tip, I cut some decorative rings. And after sanding, I applied the finish, which I'll skip through. That's it, another project finished. It's the first red bowl I've done, and I think it looks great, and I hope you like it as well. The colour looks awesome, and the swirls in the resin have an almost fire-like effect. I'd like to thank you all for watching, and I hope you will take the time to look at some of my other videos. This is my 50th upload, so you have a lot to choose from. With all that said, please subscribe if you haven't already, a thumbs up will be much appreciated, and comments are always welcome. I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye for now.